All right, we're still in domain number 1, security and risk management. We're going to go into section number 2, security governance. And in this section, we're going to talk about different kind of governance standards and governance processes. Let's take a look. All right. So what is governance? By definition, governance, and there are many different types of governance frameworks that exist. But governance includes not only guidelines and recommendations, but actual requirements for certain organizations to meet a specific certification, if they happen to be within a particular industry. The federal government or government agencies, a financial institution, healthcare institution, they're going to follow different guidelines and regulatory compliance standards. We see some examples here of NIST or ITIL, ISO 27000, COSO, COBIT, and we will certainly take a look at some of the primary governance standards that exist, and we'll get into the details of those as we go through this section here and future sections within this domain. But whether or not these governance standards apply to your organization will depend on the mission of your business, the interaction of your business with other entities, the geolocation of your business, whether or not your business is processing specific types of information or whatever it might be. Now, certainly this is one of the types of topics that ISC² loves to test on, different regulatory standards, different governance standards. So we'll spend quite a bit of time on this. Your information technology dependence, meaning what types of technologies you invest in, what you put into your business or put into your organization needs to align with the risks that are associated to your business. Now, laws and governance aren't the only thing that allows us to identify risks or potential risks within our organization. The idea of applying these laws or governance standards would be to mitigate those potential risks and avoid those risks, but not realize them. But, any organization, whether or not they fall under a category that requires some sort of governance or compliance, would still want to mitigate potential risks to the business. And we do that by implementing procedures, policies, technology, etc. within the organization. Governance is a way for us to measure whether or not we're meeting those requirements, right? Now, governance can be based on specific guidelines like NIST guidelines or ISO 27000 guidelines, or governance can be based simply on guidelines that are defined internally by different stakeholders, by a board of directors, by oversight committees, whatever it might be, third-party auditors or whatever, that are ensuring that you're meeting the principles that you defined are important to your particular organization. So governance, the governance itself, which is the kind of the oversight or the management of what you've implemented within your organization, includes activities that help us identify the risk within our organization, identify our threat landscape, if you will. What are the assets to the organization, whether they're physical assets or informational assets or tangible or non-tangible assets, personnel, etc. What are the inherent risks to those assets based on specific vulnerabilities that those assets might have? What is the likelihood that a particular attack might occur? What would be the impact if an attack was realized, et cetera, et cetera. So risk management, risk assessment, all plays into this governance principle, which allows us to ensure that we've implemented the appropriate controls and activities and training and awareness, et cetera, to be able to ensure that we're meeting our objectives. Now, again, Those objectives might be based on specific laws or regulations based on the sector of the business that we're in, or they could just simply be objectives based on what we want to achieve internally within our organization based on our overall strategy within the organization. Okay? One of the examples of a governance organization is the ITGI, the Governance Institute. The IT Governance Institute is a branch of ISACA, and it is an independent, nonprofit global association. And its goal is to engage in the development, the adaptation, or adoption, I should say, probably is a better word, the use of essentially globally acceptable information systems, knowledges, and practices. It's been around since the late 90s, I think around 1997, 98, with a goal of, advancing the international thinking or standards for an enterprise's information technology assets. So it does things like research. It proposes things like different IT strategies that align or support a business's missions or goals, and so on. So strong alignment with IT goals that are part of the business objectives. How do we measure IT performance? Hold on one second. How do we measure IT performance? How do we establish our risk management strategy related to our IT assets? How do we optimize our IT investments? And how do we use IT to deliver business value to our customers? So just an example, be informed about information security, set a direction to drive policy and strategy within your organization. What are some of the resources and objectives that we need to achieve those policies and strategies? Who in the organization is responsible for managing different aspects or assets? What are the priorities? What are the changes that are necessary within the organization to meet our goals? What is the cultural value related to risk assessment? We don't talk about this a lot, but this is a really, really important concept. Security often comes from the culture of an organization, right? And when I say culture, I mean, if the CEO of an organization doesn't have a concern for security, likes to party, likes to drink, likes to kind of let things run loose and free, then you're generally probably going to have employees that act the same way. They're going to be nonchalant about security. I'm not really concerned about it. And it's, the employee policy handbook or employee guidelines didn't state anything about me doing this or not doing this. So, it's just kind of human nature to apply the least path of resistance to our life, right? Which would include cutting corners and whatnot when it comes to security. So culture is a really, really important concept when it comes to applying security principles and whatnot to an organization. Get assurance from auditors. Just because you're doing A, B, C, and D does not mean that A, B, C, and D are effective. It is, I've talked about this personally with people as well. This concept of taking off your shoes and putting your shoes through the X-ray at an airport, does it really add to the level of security that we have when traveling on an airplane, or does it just give us the feeling that we're more secure, right? A lot of things that are implemented tend to be more about feeling than about actual function. And so you may be doing A, B, C, and D and say, oh, yeah, we're doing all of these things to ensure the security of our organization. But the reality is that A, B, C, and D make you feel better about the security, but they don't actually effectively make you more secure. So assurance from auditors and third parties that come in with a kind of a different viewpoint, they're non-biased, and they generally will be honest about what they find is more important and can be more beneficial. All right. And then we want to make sure that we're allocating the appropriate amount of resources to promote program effectiveness. This is really about training and awareness, right? Because a lot of different types of vulnerabilities, a lot of different types of attack vectors and threats that exist in an organization are based on, lack of training and awareness. Some of the most common types of attacks that happen in today's enterprises are based on social engineering. And the only way to really prevent those types of attacks is to ensure that people are aware of what to look for and they understand what it is that they're trying to achieve. So that comes through training and awareness. Draft security policies with business input, meaning that the security within our organization needs to include the input of business units, stakeholders within those business units, any kind of personnel that are kind of having to interact with this policy on a regular basis. Who are the roles? What are the roles and responsibilities? How do we identify threats to our organization? Just because a threat exists doesn't mean that we're necessarily vulnerable. Vulnerabilities have to be measured with threats in the threat landscape to be able to identify what the risk to the organization is. What are the controls that we're going to implement? What are the, are there regulatory compliance requirements that require us to report on those controls in our security policy for approval or certification? What are the priorities to implement the security projects? How do we monitor for breaches? How do we do a proactive testing and review of the security systems that we have in place? How do we educate our users? And how do we build security into the systems development lifecycle? If somebody wants to implement a new email server, security should be a component of that implementation. Security should be a consideration of that implementation. It's not just a matter of usability and functionality within the organization and the importance of the asset to the organization. It's what types of issues will be introduced by adding these additional platforms. What are the security concerns that we have with adding these additional platforms, and so on. Okay? I know this kind of makes common sense, but this is really what this exam is all about, particularly when it comes to this domain. So, it's not part of ITGI, but it does kind of parallel what ITGI identifies. We need to protect assets with different types of controls. There are physical controls, administrative controls, managerial controls, technical controls, and operational controls. All right, and we will get into the details of what each of these controls are and how we classify them later on. Some of these can kind of be combined. Typically physical controls would be physical barriers like walls and gates and locks and so on. Administrative controls and managerial controls can kind of be combined together as employee handbook, human resource controls, non-disclosure agreements, acceptable use policies, what I would consider policies, procedures, and guidelines. What are the potential punishments, right, if you don't comply with particular rules and so on. Technical controls would be the controls that you have in your organization that are related to technology, like implementing a firewall or antivirus or IPS or IDS and so on. And then operational controls would be, again, more like policies or procedures. What are standard operations for accessing a protected room? What is the standard operational control that we implement, which could include all kinds of different other types of controls, to send data to a third party or whatever. All right. But we want to make sure that we're managing our assets to reduce risk to the loss of the three things that we talked about in the first section, that CIA triad. We don't want to lose confidentiality, we don't want to lose integrity, and we don't want to lose availability. All right. So IS security management validates policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines, ensures that they're being implemented to apply or to at least achieve an acceptable level of risk. It is impossible to mitigate risk to 0%. Risk will always exist. Physically, intellectually, technically, risk will always exist. You're never 100% protected. But we understand that. Our goal is to move us to a level of risk that is acceptable. And honestly, quite frankly, most of the time that's going to be financially driven, right? Risk is measured in quantitative loss, typically a dollar value. If intellectual property is leaked or somebody steals our designs or gets access to personal information, how much is that going to cost the organization? All right. So we try to achieve an acceptable level of risk. Now, there are many different ways that we can do that: mitigate the risk, transfer the risk, avoid the risk, etc. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But the idea is that we're implementing all of these controls to get to that concept. All right. Security professionals, you guys, are going to act as risk advisors. Whether you're a chief information security officer or you're just a data analyst or a contributor to an overall security team, we need to be able to weigh the risks to our organization and implement the appropriate controls based on that risk to be able to identify the residual risk that is left over after the fact, right? And that residual risk is what has to be acceptable to our organization. So we implement policies and controls in response to the risks that we've identified in our organization. We have to understand what we expect out of those controls. What is the end result of implementing those particular controls? What are the effectiveness of those controls? And how do we verify that? Through active monitoring. I've always told anybody that goes through any of my security training classes that security is a living, breathing thing. It is not a static thing. What you implement today may be adequate for today, but it may not be adequate for tomorrow. So it's important that we're continually evaluating and assessing the effectiveness of the various controls that we put into place to this point. We use knowledge as input to our next assessment. So it's kind of a revolving door, if you will. At this point, this is the information we've gathered. This is the result of applying that information to our assessment process, and we'll go through that cycle over and over again. Okay? So initially, we have to identify the assets in our organization. All right? And we're trying to apply the CIA concepts to those assets within the organization. We do our risk assessments to determine the needs to protecting those assets. We implement various policies and controls to ensure that we are achieving our objectives or our goals from a risk management standpoint. We provide training and awareness for the controls that are implemented, because quite frankly, those controls might be managed or at least controlled by multiple individuals within the organization. We have to have a way of monitoring and evaluating that process to ensure that the effectiveness of the program. If there are weaknesses that we identify within the program, then we go ahead and assess additional risks, or the risks that existed yesterday are different than the risks that exist today. So it's a constant life cycle approach, kind of like a circular concept here. Okay? As an information security professional, you have to understand transformational events that affect the business. Acquisitions and mergers, right? Buying or acquiring another organization. Divestitures or spinoffs. Taking a business unit within a large enterprise and spinning off that business unit into a separate entity. When big things like this happen within an organization, when these changes occur, the organization fundamentally changes as well. The personnel that are involved in managing and maintaining those assets might change. The assets themselves might change. Their physical location might change. The overall goal of the business or objectives of the business might change. So you have to adapt to those changes, right? A divestiture would be a process of selling off a business. For example, Ford just announced that they're selling off their stake in Rivian. I don't know how you say that specifically, but which is a EV manufacturer. But we have government's committees that allow us to manage this process, right? Government's committees, whether they're internal or external, third party or internal, provides oversight, provides strategic objectives and directives for the implementation of these security components, and then provides counsel to identify, we have SMEs or subject matter experts and participants in those committees that can provide input as to how effective the security program is, etc., within the organization. In an acquisition or merger, as a security professional, you should be aware of the different types of data that need protection. When you acquire another organization, they may have a completely different security posture. They may be implementing different protocols. They may have different databases. They may have different personnel. Obviously, you have to incorporate that into your overall security architecture because now they're part of you. Different technology types that need protection. So they may have a vast array of Linux platforms. And Linux was never a concern within your organization because you didn't have any Linux platforms in your organization. All right. New staff and roles with needs for security awareness training. Again, the culture might be different between these organizations. One organization might have a security-centric culture, security-focused culture, whereas another organization might be kind of lax on security awareness and training. Threats from former or new employees, right? You're acquiring an organization and you're bringing on 1,000 new employees. You don't know how necessarily those employees were vetted. You don't understand the process. Maybe you did your due diligence and you identified that prior to the acquisition, but it's possible that the same rules that you guys applied to onboarding employees in your organization might be different than the other organization that you acquired. So you might, of course, want to verify that. As companies merge, employees get repositioned or they get laid off. Then you have disgruntled employees or unhappy employees that might now be inclined to act nefariously because they're, upset or whatever. Vulnerabilities with merged systems. Systems independent of each other are relatively secure. We can apply security to those systems independently. But by combining A and B, you might result in a completely different security posture because of the way those particular devices interact with each other, the way they communicate with each other. You might have different compliance requirements. We talk about data sovereignty quite a bit. And based on geolocation, Europe has different regulatory requirements than the United States versus Asia versus Africa or whatever. You're going to see that new policies have to be implemented based on different compliance requirements in areas or geographical areas that you didn't previously operate in. Also, there might be external business partner relationships that get incorporated through the acquisition as well. Kind of the same concept when we talk about divestitures and spinoffs. When you're spinning off an organization, typically assets are leaving with that spinoff or that divestiture. Those assets may no longer be under your immediate control. So you have to be concerned about, what those individuals know, what they understand, etc., to be able to understand what the residual risk is for that separation, that spinoff. Let's see. Systems interconnections, protocols or ports are left open when they're no longer needed. Right. Company A as a whole might have implemented different internet connections, different protocols, different port numbers, different services, different resources. But when company A split into company A and B went off to do its own thing, all of a sudden those particular resources are no longer necessary or no longer needed. And we have to go and kind of lock down or get rid of those features that are no longer necessary. Let's see. Loss of logging and visibility if the logging system moves with the new organization. Always threats from people that aren't happy, right? Oftentimes in a divestiture or a spinoff, employees lose their job and they might be inclined again to do something kind of bad. The need for revised policies and procedures. Of course, all of these things are changing. So we need to grow and adapt our security posture and the policies and procedures and guidelines that we have to meet those new objectives. And then we may have deadlines as well for segregating the information. Okay. Now, the next section here, I would say probably doesn't hold a lot of weight from an exam perspective. It's relatively straightforward, but every organization, depending on its size, will have different roles and responsibilities within that organization for security. And so you might have an information security officer. You might have a chief information security officer. You might have a chief information officer. These are all kind of your CXO definitions, or you could just simply have an IT director that wears the hat of security, or even a CEO that wears the hat of security within an organization. It depends on how large the organization is and so on. Will determine, really kind of how much structure you have within that organization. But typically with these types of individuals, an ISSO or a CISO or a CIO, these are going to be technical individuals. They're traditionally have always been kind of informational security folks, meaning IT assets, but now they're playing more and more of a role in physical security as well, which is kind of interesting. But that's because a lot of physical security is now implemented using technical controls, biometric locks and man traps and IP-enabled security cameras, etc. Now, from a functional standpoint, we would certainly incorporate the use of security and information risk management relating to IT assets. But again, it could fall outside of the scope of IT as well, because we are in a CXO position, or at least a chief information position. We would have to be aware of, risks to assets not totally or entirely related to technology, like physical assets like fences and lighting and barriers and so on. These individuals would report to a C-level executive, probably most likely a CEO. A CISSO or a CISO might report to a CIO or a CTO, Chief Technology Officer, but for the most part, pretty high level. Okay. What is the role of an information security officer? To ensure the protection of a business information assets from loss, disclosure, alteration, destruction, or unavailability. The CIA triad. All right, so the CIO or ISO, is going to define the policies. It's going to direct others within the organization to implement and execute those policies. And because risk is ever changing, the threatscape is always changing. This means this is a cumulative and cyclic process, right? We are going to continue to do this on a regular basis. These ISO officers are generally responsible for ensuring that security policies, procedures, baselines, standards, and guidelines are adhered to meet the information security needs of the organization. And again, we will talk about the difference between a policy and a procedure, baseline, standard, and guideline a little bit later on. There's some similarities between these terms, but there are certain things that make these terms individually unique. All right, most policies that we implement are drafted to last 2 to 3 years. I would say 12 months could be pretty common as well. An annual review, policy review. Policies may differ if the organization is a technology follower versus an early adopter. Early adopters tend to accept more risk within the organization, what we call bleeding edge, not leading edge. You're going to get cut a little bit, you're going to bleed a little bit, but you're also going to have the advantage of a head start with technology as opposed to a technology follower, which is leading edge, not right in front, but right behind the front person. All right. ISO is also responsible for ensuring compliance. That's what the policies and objectives of those policies are. We might run a CERT. You'll see this term on the exam for sure. A computer incident response team. The composition of that team will depend on the organization, but these are the individuals that would be responding to any security-related event that occurs within the organization. Sometimes they're simply called IRTs because some of the responses are non-technical. In other words, they're not really directly related to a piece of technology, but a physical asset. Officers involved in management teams and planning meetings. Of course, you have to go to your meetings. You have to be part of the planning events, and you have to know the organization's mission. What are the objectives of the organization? What are the goals of the organization? And how do we implement the appropriate security controls? All right. Now, what do we do to identify risks for executive management? The security officer has to understand the threats to the organization. Now, again, just because an organization has threats does not mean that it's necessarily vulnerable. When we're going to talk about this quite a bit after the break. this idea of risk assessment. Risk assessment boils down to two concepts. What is the likelihood that an event is going to occur? And what is the impact to our organization when it does? Everything about assessing risk is based on those two components. What is the likelihood that something is going to occur? And what is the impact? If it's a low likelihood, high impact, I might still address that concern. If it is a high likelihood but low impact, I might be inclined to accept that type of risk within the organization. And certainly low likelihood and low impact would be kind of the last thing on the list, but it's typically always going to be based on what is the likelihood and the impact. So just because a threat exists doesn't necessarily mean that we are vulnerable. We have to identify the assets within our organization. We then have to identify the vulnerabilities of those particular assets. Vulnerabilities are ways for, will provide ways for attackers to use exploits against those weaknesses to be able to compromise a system. So identifying vulnerabilities is a very, very critical step in identifying risks and reporting those risks to the executive management team. The goal of the executive management team, quite frankly, and it's based on dollars, is applying mitigation techniques, reducing the risk to an acceptable level, what we call a risk appetite, without having to spend a lot of money. Right? In fact, spend the least amount of money to effectively deliver the highest gain, which would be reducing risk in this particular case. It is a cost-benefit analysis, what I like to call layer 8 of the OSI model. Layer 8 being budget, layer 9 being politics. Obviously not really defined by OSI, but you know, it really does play a role in what our posture is going to be. So what are the real perceived threats to our organization? What is the risk? Oftentimes people equate threat to risk, and that is not the case. Threats are different than risk. Risk is, again, likelihood and impact. Likelihood and impact. That's how we define risk. What is the likelihood that something is going to happen? What is going to be the impact of the organization when it does? What is the cost of the safeguard? If the impact to the organization is measured in dollars and the impact is $50,000, right, per incident or per year, whatever it might be, but the safeguard to reduce that risk never to zero, but let's say we reduce it to $10,000. But if the cost of that safeguard is $30,000, does that make sense, right? Let me redraw that zero there. Does it make sense to invest in this safeguard? In this case, it would make sense, right? Because the overall cost or the amount of dollars that we would be saving would be $40,000, right? So we're saying, okay, if I can reduce the risk down to $10,000 from $50,000, that's a $40,000 difference. It's going to cost me $30,000 to do it, but in the end, I'm saving $10,000. That's a quantitative approach. We'll talk about that in more detail later on. This is the residual risk. This is the risk that's left over after I apply the mitigation. How long will the project take? I guess that could be a concern. You know, how long is it going to take for us to complete this? To get to this point of acceptable risk. And, you know, honestly, it would be something that doesn't necessarily stop, because obviously this is a living, breathing thing. We have to continually evaluate, monitor, and readjust and reapply. Okay. So what are some of the reporting models that we have? Obviously, reporting is going to be a key element to any security stance or security policy, because individuals that are responsible for ensuring that the security policy is effective and it's doing what we want it to do within our organization they're most likely not the individuals that are going to be responsible for actually implementing the policy. They're the ones that are going to be responsible for making sure that the policy is effective. So we're going to have to report to those individuals. Obviously, the primary goal is to maintain our security posture. And so reporting is a very important concept. We want to make sure that inaccurate information or information that is not pertinent to what we're trying to achieve within our security objectives is not being reported. We want to filter out the information that's not valuable to our organization and whatnot. And also, we don't want to run into a situation where we have paralysis by analysis, meaning that we're reporting so much information that there isn't value, or at least the valuable information that's included isn't lost in the magnitude of the amount of information that's being reported. So we want to make sure that we have accurate and sensible reporting so that we're able to identify specifically what it is that we're trying to identify. We want to understand that senior management is not only initially invested in our security policies and our security position, but they continue to maintain that investment, because ultimately it's most likely going to require additional investments over time. It's going to require additional input over time. And as this is a living, breathing thing, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate budget, we have the appropriate resources on a continual basis to make sure that we're maintaining our security posture and maintaining the compliance parameters that we've set for ourselves in our organization. There needs to be an individual responsible for ensuring that this information and information security in general throughout the enterprise is being well maintained, and that there is some accountability for shortfalls or failures between any implementation that we might have versus what our original objectives or goals were. Now, who's doing that reporting? Well, it could be a tiered model, right? You could have subject matter experts or key stakeholders that are reporting on the compliance stance that they have within their own realms or their own circle of influence. And then you have maybe a CISO or a CIO reporting to an executive team or a board on the overall stance for the security of the organization. The key element, though, to the reporting is that you want to make sure that the reporting is accurate, number one. You want to make sure that the data that you send into that reporting architecture represents realistically what the stance of the organization is. You can run into situations where somebody is reporting that certain levels of security are being achieved or maintained because of false or misleading information, and then all of a sudden there's some sort of attack or some sort of event or incident, and all of a sudden the CEO or even the clients or the customers that may be affected by a breach or whatnot are like, well, I thought that we were protected from that. Last month, you delivered a report that said that this was not a threat to us, and then all of a sudden that threat was realized, and now we're kind of left with our hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. Reporting to the CEO, there are instances where reporting to the CEO is not only prudent, but also required. There have been a lot of regulations, a lot of compliance guidelines that have been established that places the responsibility on the CEO for compliance. And that was always kind of a thing in the past, that organizations didn't have, the CEO wasn't fully vested, or the shareholders weren't fully vested in security, because they didn't have any type of legal or criminal responsibility for events that occurred. Based on we'll talk about due care and due diligence a little bit later on, but based on lack of due care and lack of due diligence, the CEO was kind of always protected as this figurehead. But now a lot of different regulations say, nope, the CEO is no longer protected, and the CEO can be prosecuted if something happens, not because the CEO technically knows what to do or is technically responsible for implementing security, but the CEO drives culture. The CEO establishes, potentially establishes budgets and monetary spend for protecting assets. If the CEO doesn't have any skin in the game, so to speak, they may be less inclined to focus attention on the security. So we'll talk about some different regulations. Sarbanes-Oxley is a good example of one of them in the financial sector, where the CEO no longer is protected just because they happen to be the CEO. Credit card companies, they mention that here specifically. Technology companies, companies with revenues that are dependent on internet commerce might use this method. Notice that a lot of this is related to financial, has a financial spin to it, if you will. And that's because of different regulations. The CEO can no longer simply say, well, I'm just the CEO. I don't really know what my senior vice presidents or my directors of engineering or whatnot are doing individually. I kind of just oversee the whole vision. And that's no longer a way out, I guess, if you will. All right. So we will see specific examples where reporting to the CEO is actually required based on the regulatory standard. U.S. civilian government agencies are required to report a breach of personally identifiable information to the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or U.S. CERT, within an hour of discovery. Now, this is an example of regulation that might require reporting to the CEO because of the underlying requirement that any U.S. civilian agency that happens to be a contractor or working for the Department of Defense or another government agency has to meet this particular requirement. What can happen if this doesn't occur? You could have fines, you could have potential civil and criminal liability based on negligence, or negligent factors, and so on. So again, it depends on the business at hand, and it depends on what that business is involved in. But that is one of the responsibilities of a chief information security officer, is to understand, maybe not necessarily the letter of the law. We have lawyers and legal counsel and other representatives within the organization that can interpret the letter of the law, but understand the impact of regulations and the impact of rules that fall within the scope of our particular business. All right. In a smaller organization, maybe a more commercial organization, maybe a private sector organization as opposed to a public sector organization, reporting to the IT department or some sort of IT manager or IT director might be more specific or more prudent. If you're, fall under this scope as a chief information security officer, you might chief information security officer, or even a security analyst or security architect, you might report to a CIO, CTO, or some person that is one level or maybe two levels separated from the CEO. In this case, security is more, technologically focused as opposed to culturally focused and budgetarily focused, because we are dealing with technical individuals. The advantage to this reporting model is that, generally speaking, everybody in the chain of custody or the chain of care is probably going to be technically minded. They're going to understand risk from a technical perspective. They're going to understand what the underlying technology represents and how we implement that technology and so on. The downside is the conflict of interest with the CIO's goals, which are generally not security related specifically. CIOs are generally responsible for ensuring that applications are available, that network-based services are available, that databases are available, and so on. And security, even though it should be a core component to that, is not really there for producing delivery. It's kind of an adjunct to the fact that those applications exist and those technologies exist with security in mind, right? So generally, the CIO is, yes, we need these email servers, and they have to be up and running 99.999% of the time. Whether or not security is applied or not does not necessarily relate to availability, although it could directly, right? If you're talking about denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks and so on. All right. Generally, this model is avoided because of the individuals that fall between the CIO and the CEO and the information security officer. Now, that was in the CBK for ISC squared. I mean, I could see where that would be applicable. You have multiple layers of communication. And as you add more layers of communication, the reporting gets a little bit more complex. And frankly, the objectives of those individuals changes. So I could see where that would be a consideration. All right. Layer 8 of the OSI model budget. I say that facetiously. That's not really in the 7-layer model of the OSI, but we talk about, budget and politics being always a consideration when we're implementing technologies and procedures and policies and whatnot. But the ISO would provide a budget for the information security architecture. That budget would be a conglomeration of all of the individual budgets that each department would have. Costs are considered throughout the life cycle of the IS component, and we are going to talk about different modeling methods for modeling cost for the life cycle of a individual component. A security officer has to work with managers, so security is included in the project cost. Oftentimes, when individual managers or engineers or whatnot are developing systems or implementing systems, they're not necessarily incorporating the security elements into that design. So it's important as an information security officer that you work with the managers to ensure that they understand what the security culture is of the organization, what the impact is of introducing this new technology to that organization, and what security concerns would have to be addressed, which includes the cost of that security as well. Access administration, intrusion detection, and emerging technologies get funded. Access administration is always one of those things that pretty much everybody understands, right? How do we ensure the identification and authentication and authorization of individuals? If I go to my CEO and say we're putting in this new data center, but we want to make sure that only these individuals can access that data center, and we want to use these technologies to do that, multi-factor authentication and so on. But the we need this technology to do that, right? That's an easy, tangible thing to demonstrate. We can't just simply have our data center open to the public. We need that. But, things like intrusion detection, emerging technologies for providing other security features within the organization, like an identity service engine to do zero trust network attachment strategies and stuff like that. That's a little bit harder to quantify because it's, you need intrusion detection, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have an intrusion. You just want to be able to detect if we do. That costs a lot of money. What's the likelihood that we're going to have this intrusion kind of thing, right? Whereas access administration is something that's almost always necessary and visible. You have to examine, as an ISO, the current risks to the organization. You have to identify the tasks, and you would want to be able to identify the best cost-benefit analysis. Right? If a vulnerability introduces a high cost, we would call that high impact, and a high likelihood, we would most likely want to apply more importance to that risk, as opposed to something that might be low impact or low likelihood. All right. And obviously that makes sense, right? If it's a very low likelihood and really a low impact to the organization, do I want to invest precious dollars into mitigating that particular risk or that vulnerability, as opposed to focusing on the more impactful things? All right. Typically, we're dealing with long-term projects, but those long-term projects are less preferred than short-term projects. And that's just based on rate of return, right? We want to make sure that the security projects that we're implementing are going into effect quickly, that they have the quickest impact, etc. And long-term projects tend to be costly, and we don't realize the return, for a couple of years, which can be difficult to sell. All right? The longer the payback period, the higher rate of return is expected. Meaning, yes, if we're going to be out of pocket $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, and it's going to cost 10 years to get that back, once we do realize that payback, what is that investment going to result in? Is it going to result in a high rate of return or a lower rate of return? Obviously, it's easier to sell if it's going to result in a higher rate of return. All right. The number of staff and qualifications, the required protection, the tasks that we're implementing, the training, the regulations, the metric tracking, all of these things drive the budgets that are necessary. And that's a really, really difficult thing for an individual CIO or information security, I should say CISO, or information security officer to wear as their responsibility. If you think about it, you think about each staff and qualifications. I mean, as an information security officer, are you really going to be driving hiring practices and interviews and for the entire organization? Are we going to define all of those individual tasks? Are we going to be responsible for doing the training? It's a lot of hats to wear. So you may be, as an ISO, responsible for ensuring that these things are occurring, and you're getting reports that identify that these things are occurring, but you're not going to be, technically responsible for implementing all of these aspects and facets. It would be practically impossible as an individual. All right. It's also very important that we have a way of measuring the success of the programs. All those things I just mentioned in the previous slide. Metrics allow us to do that. Metrics allow us to define essentially benchmarks or what our targets are or goals are for a program. And we can measure those against those metrics to identify the success or the the functionality of the programs that we have in place. Who is going to collect those metrics, right? First of all, we need to be able to identify, and this would probably be even kind of the first thing that I would identify is what statistics are we going to actually collect? Remember, metrics and measurements are a way for us to evaluate the successfulness or the success of the program. And are there improvements that we need to make? Are there weaknesses in the program? Are there things that are falling short? Because as we've all seen, that little kind of cliche, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And that is really true when it comes to security. All right, so maybe there is a weak part in our program that we need to address. These metrics and the values that we collect hopefully will demonstrate that. Where are those statistics going to be collected? What are the minimums, right? The baselines that we define. We need to know what our goals are and what our baselines are to know what we're deviating from, to know the deviations of those baselines or those goals. That's a very important concept. If we don't understand what the baselines are, what the thresholds are, how can we define what the anomalies are? And what do we do if we don't meet metrics, right? I've worked a lot with different organizations that do contracting, subcontracting for other organizations. And the measure of success for the subcontractor is, monthly or quarterly or annual metrics that have to be met. Maybe it's a computer fulfillment company, and they have to replace or provision 20 computers a week or 100 computers a week or whatnot. That would be one of the metrics that they would be measured against. Are you deploying these computers? Maybe we're using a SCAP scanner or some other type of device to identify whether or not those computers meet their baseline configuration thresholds and so on. So there's all kinds of metrics that can be measured. But in the end, it has to be actionable information. Ultimately, it's highly unlikely that you're going to hit every tick or check every box, and that there's going to be some shortfall. And so there has to be actionable data that we can take action against. What are some of the resources to a information security officer? Network administrators, they'd be your subject matter experts for all things network related, database administrators, system administrators, policy and compliance officers, and legal counsel for interpreting laws and regulations and for providing input based on audits, law enforcement personnel. If you're in an industry that involves, or potentially could involve cybercrime or some sort of criminal activity, law enforcement could get involved. Quality assurance testers, third-party testers, penetration testers, vulnerability scanners, red team individuals, that kind of thing. Help desk / service desk technicians. They can provide valuable information based on user experience and customer experience. The security programs themselves need to be supported indirectly by budget officers that have no clue typically what technology is, but they need to understand that they need to allocate specific dollars. Procurement officers and procurement specialists. You think about that and you think, well, what does the guy buying the routers have to do with our security architecture? Well, one of the key threat vectors that exist is supply chain. And procurement specialists are typically the ones that are establishing what that supply chain looks like based on the general requirements to purchase information. That's why those particular officers might be involved. Business analysts, the business analysts would be, obviously individuals that are looking at the business from, a customer service type of perspective. Maybe they're looking at based on mission statement or visionary statement of the business, or just the general goal of the business from a market perspective. They would provide input. Administrative personnel, professionals, enterprise architects, software developers. This is just a list of a few, right? But you can imagine, based on this list, who might be involved in security. Human resources would be, one of those major categories that would fall under administrative professionals. Human resources. Even today, we have businesses now that are employing the use of medical professionals. So you have health compliance officers now that are sitting in a business that are full-time, offering consultative services based on COVID response, from a regulatory standpoint and from an asset standpoint, protecting individuals. I mean, my kid's school, he goes to a private school in Pasadena, and they have now a new position at the school, health compliance officer. And it's all about, COVID testing and COVID strategy and regulations and whatnot, if they want to host an event or if they want the kids to go to school. That was just based on what's happening in the world today, something that had to be added. Okay. What is an information security strategy? There are three major components to your information security. The what we call strategic planning. The how, the tactical planning, and the action, the operational and project planning. So if you break it down to the what, the how, and the action, the terms kind of make sense, right? The what is our overall strategy. Now that would be identifying, maybe doing your risk assessment, your risk evaluation at this level. Whereas the how is, we've identified these vulnerabilities, we've identified this threat surface, we've identified this technology. So the how is, how are we going to mitigate this risk? What controls are we going to put in place? And then the action is the implementation of those controls. The operational, the project planning, ultimately to incorporate the projects and get them done, right? So strategic planning and tactical planning would be terms that might be difficult to define on the exam unless you understand what the difference is between the strategy and the tactics. Strategy is what our goal is and what our objective is. That's what our plan is. And the tactics are how we incorporate or implement that plan. All right. And then the operation, of course, would be the effective action that we take to meet the strategy. So strategic plans are typically something that have a long-term horizon. They're not necessarily specifically defined. Strategy can be detailed, but it can also be kind of just goal-oriented or generalized in nature. It should be reviewed minimally on an annual basis if there are major changes to the business. So an example would be, we're not in a pandemic, we are in a pandemic. We have to shift our entire strategy because now we have people working from home. We don't have access to physical resources we typically had access to. We have limited staff or reduced staff. I mean, you could imagine that would force any major business to change their. I mean, if their long-term strategy is 3 to 5 years, that would be a significant change, right? So I would say even in the case of minimally reviewing on an annual basis, obviously there's going to be one-off scenarios where, the government just mandated that everybody must be vaccinated. Well, that changes a lot of things because we're going to have employee retention issues. We're going to have some sort of compliance functionality that we've got to incorporate to ensure that the vaccinations are being done, et cetera. All right. Also, technology does tend to change quite frequently. Technology changes more often than 3 to 5 years, typically, especially in an organization that's very technology driven and technology focused. So you might have to adjust your strategic planning time scale a little bit based on that. What should strategic goals include? What are the policies and procedures that we're going to implement within our organization? How do we deploy the technology? They specifically mention servers and desktops and network devices. But how do we deploy technology in general to reduce downtime? Make sure that end users understand what their roles and responsibilities are within the organization and within the overall goal or goals of this security architecture. Establish the security organization to manage our enterprise security. All right. This is really important because it may require the addition of personnel. Maybe you have subject matter experts individually that understand the security of your DNS servers or security of your Exchange servers and so on. But you don't want a DNS server admin or an email server admin reporting to the CEO or the CTO of the security of that platform. You want to have some sort of kind of pyramid of reporting that streamlines the reporting process, which can include the use of technology as a reporting mechanism as well, like an SIEM. So we'll talk about SIEMs a little bit later on. So you need to establish the security organization. Now, again, it could be individuals that already exist, but it could also be a new individual that is responsible. Tactical planning, right? This is the second stage. We've identified our strategy. We've identified our long-term goals. Now what we need to do is derive the actual technical response, right? We understand the initiatives. We want, and the whole point of employing this tactical planning is to achieve those goals. The plans in this case are more specific. They can spin off or include multiple projects and multiple teams. Typically, this is 6 to 18 months, and it is, as a whole, you can have multiple tactical plans, but as a whole, it is the way that we achieve our overall strategy. Okay. Operational and project planning, the final phase. We want to have plans that have milestones, dates, accountabilities to ensure project completion. One of the tools that we use to do that is a Gantt chart. Project planning, Microsoft Project is a good example of an application that allows us to do that. We have different tasks that need to be achieved. Those tasks have different timelines. Some of them are independent tasks. Some of them are dependent on the successful completion of previous tasks. But we can assign resources to those tasks, timelines, and so on, which then ultimately will result in a completed project. So what types of projects might be included? Well, certainly there has to be some sort of risk assessment, right? That assessment is critical to the success of our security architecture or security project, because how do we know what to protect if we don't know what to protect, right? How do we know what we're trying to protect if we don't know what our valuable assets are and what the vulnerabilities of those assets are, what the threat scape looks like in relation to those assets? So it's very important to do a risk assessment. We need to develop security policies and some sort of approval process based on those policies. And that can involve the incorporation of human resources input, legal counsel input. We don't want to put policies in place that are suspect or that can be challenged. Or frankly, we don't want to put policies in place that reduce our functionality to a crawl, meaning that the business can't function because they have so much security in place. Develop technical infrastructure to deploy policies and track compliance. Yes, we want to be able to deploy the policies, but more importantly, we want to be able to see if those policies are effective. And that's where the metrics and the measurements come into play. Train our users on the policies and always monitor for compliance. And then, of course, it's a cycle. We go through the process again for the next change in our strategic position and our tactical implementations and so on. Could be steps or tasks from a plan, or it could be multiple plans. And again, this could be something that we do iteratively. Plans could be implemented in parallel or in series, depending on what's required in the organization. All right. All right. Projects now look to achieve short-term or interim results as well. Although we don't have necessarily, we have an overall goal, right? And remember, that strategic plan is long-term. We don't want to realize that we have to wait 18, 24, 36 months to achieve our objective. We want to be able to achieve small victories along the way. So it's building to our final objective. And I say final very loosely because this changes constantly. But, I don't want to say, okay, we're starting at point A, and in 36 months, we're going to be at point B, and there's nothing in between. Ideally, we would like to say, okay, these particular projects are a priority based on the security footprint, et cetera. So we're going to go ahead and implement these, and these should be done within the next 3 months. That would be a tick box or a check box as a short-term goal to demonstrative short-term goal to say, yes, we now have some security in place, particularly for our most important assets.